Today, you'll get to know the story of Albert and Cindy, two people who never expected to fall in love, but amidst contracts and responsibilities, they discovered the true meaning of family. If you've ever experienced a moment when everything suddenly changed, get ready, because this story will speak directly to your heart. Albert Thomas, a 45-year-old businessman, was the kind of man everyone admired. He had built a solid empire in the business world and lived in a luxurious house on the outskirts of Chicago. On the outside, his life seemed perfect. His career was impeccable, his bank accounts kept growing, and he had the respect of his colleagues and employees. But deep inside, Albert felt a void that even his professional success couldn't fill. The absence of a family, of someone who could carry on his legacy, haunted him every day. He had been married twice, and both relationships ended in failure. The women who had come into his life seemed more interested in his fortune than in him as a person. He no longer believed in love and had distanced himself from any emotional involvement. Yet, a deep desire remained, to have a child, someone who could continue his lineage, someone to whom he could leave everything he had built. In Albert's office, Cindy worked, an ordinary employee who had earned his respect over time. She was responsible for many administrative tasks, organizing his schedule, meetings, and documents. Although they were from completely different worlds, Albert and Cindy had developed a friendship over the years. She was kind, discreet, and always willing to help, but above all, she was someone he trusted. Cindy, a 28-year-old woman, never imagined she would be involved in Albert's most intimate thoughts. To her, he was just her boss, a distant man focused on business who rarely showed his emotions. She came from a humble background and had worked hard to get that job. She was always grateful for the opportunity to work there, but she never imagined that anything beyond work could come out of that relationship. It all started on an ordinary afternoon. Albert was in his office, lost in thought as he gazed out at the horizon. He found himself reflecting on his life, on what was truly missing. That's when an idea began to take shape. He knew he didn't want to get emotionally involved with anyone anymore, but he still wanted a child, an heir he could raise, someone to carry on his name. Cindy came to his mind almost automatically. She was a woman he knew and respected, and despite being just colleagues, there was a certain closeness and trust between them. In the following days, Albert thought about the idea obsessively. He needed to find a way to bring up the subject with Cindy without scaring her. The proposal he had in mind was, to say the least, unexpected, and he knew he had to be careful. One afternoon, while the office was quieter, he asked Cindy to come to his office. As soon as she entered, Albert closed the door and invited her to sit down, something he rarely did. Cindy felt a slight tension in the air. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, surprised by the formality. Albert looked at her, visibly pensive, before he began to speak. "Cindy, what I'm about to say may seem unusual, maybe even crazy, but I need you to listen with an open mind," he began. "I've noticed how reliable, dedicated, and loyal you are. And lately, I've been thinking about what is truly missing from my life." Cindy frowned, trying to understand where this conversation was heading. "I've always wanted to have a child, someone who could carry on my legacy," Albert continued, his tone serious. "But after 2 failed marriages, I don't want to get romantically involved with anyone. I'm not looking for a wife. What I need is a trustworthy person to help me have a child. And after much reflection, I thought of you." Albert's words hung in the air as Cindy tried to process what he had just said. She was stunned, unable to speak for a few moments before stammering, "You're asking me to have your child?" "Yes, but in a purely practical way," he replied. "I would take care of you throughout the pregnancy. You wouldn't need to worry about anything. It would be an artificial insemination, of course, without any physical involvement between us. And I would pay generously for it. After the child is born, you would be free to go on with your life however you wish." The shock was immediate. Cindy looked at Albert, trying to determine if this was a joke, but his serious expression confirmed it wasn't. He was actually proposing this. Though she was scared, Cindy knew Albert was not an ordinary man. He had always been straightforward, and everything about him was meticulously planned. I don't know what to say," she murmured, still trying to process the gravity of the situation. Albert, noticing her confusion, leaned forward. "I know this is unexpected, but I trust you, Cindy. I wouldn't ask this of anyone else. I want you to think carefully before giving me an answer. This is not a decision you need to make right now." The following days were filled with total confusion for Cindy. Albert's proposal lingered, invading her thoughts at every moment. She didn't know how to react. It was a financial opportunity that could change her life forever, but at the same time, it was an enormous responsibility. Having a child, even under these circumstances, was not a simple thing. A week later, she returned to Albert's office with her decision made. "I accept," she said firmly. "But I want some guarantees. I don't want this to affect my life afterward, and I want the process to be completely ethical and safe." Albert nodded, relieved at her acceptance. "Of course. We'll make a legal contract, with all the conditions clearly defined. I'll take care of everything, and you can rest assured that nothing will affect your life after the birth." And so, the preparations began. Albert and Cindy signed the contract, and the process of artificial insemination was initiated. In the beginning, it was purely practical, devoid of emotions. Cindy spent most of her time focused on her work and staying resolute in the decision she had made. But the insemination process had worked, and now she was actually pregnant. As the months went by and the pregnancy progressed, something began to change. Cindy could feel the life growing inside her, and with that, an inevitable bond began to form. The baby she carried wasn't just part of a deal, it was a being she was learning to love. And surprisingly, Albert also began to change. The man who had always been controlled and distant found himself increasingly involved with the idea of becoming a father. The turning point happened during a routine checkup. The doctor smiled as he looked at the ultrasound and announced, "You are expecting triplets." Silence filled the room. Albert and Cindy were speechless. 3 lives. 3 children. The impact of this news was overwhelming for both of them. From that moment, their relationship began to transform. As the months passed and Cindy's pregnancy progressed, Albert, always present as he had promised, was there for every moment. What had started as a purely practical agreement began to unfold into something much deeper. Cindy was carrying not just one child, but 3 triplets. This had initially surprised them both, but now the pregnancy required special care. It was delicate and demanded constant attention. Albert, although always focused on keeping everything under control, began to genuinely worry about Cindy's well-being. He had never planned to get emotionally involved, but seeing her caring so lovingly for the children growing inside her, something inside him started to change. Everything seemed to be going well until one day, during a routine examination, Cindy began to feel unwell. She felt a sudden pain, something that left her breathless and alarmed the medical team. Albert, who was in the adjacent room, was urgently called in. When he saw her pale, with a worried expression, an unfamiliar sense of panic washed over him. Without hesitation, he rushed to her side, holding her hand firmly, trying to offer comfort. The doctors acted quickly, and fortunately, they discovered it was just a minor complication, but it would require more rest and intensive care. Cindy would have to stay under observation for a few days, and Albert didn't leave her side for even a moment. He watched her sleep, her tired face appearing softer, more fragile than he had ever noticed. Until that moment, Albert had seen her merely as an employee, someone he trusted to help him realize his plan of having a child. But now, seeing her there, so vulnerable, he realized there was much more to this woman than he had ever allowed himself to see. In the following days, Albert personally took care of Cindy. He arranged for her to have everything she needed, made sure he was present in every detail, and comforted her with a kindness she had never expected from him. Slowly, what started as concern turned into something deeper. He began to notice small things about her, how she smiled softly when she talked about the babies, how her eyes sparkled with joy when she heard their heartbeats during appointments. Albert, who had always kept an emotional distance, now found himself increasingly drawn to this woman who had so unexpectedly become the center of his attention. As Cindy recovered, they started talking more. It was no longer about the contract, about the agreement. They talked about life, about the babies that were coming, about the dreams Cindy once had before all this happened. Albert, who had always been a man of few words, found himself wanting to know more about her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. And as he listened to her, he began to notice something that troubled him. He was falling in love. It was subtle at first, a slight unease that grew day by day. He felt an increasing need to protect her, to ensure she was always all right, not just because she was carrying his children, but because she meant something more. Albert began to see Cindy as the incredible woman she had always been, but whom he had never allowed himself to notice before. He kept these feelings to himself. He didn't know how Cindy would react. What would she think if she knew that he, who had been so firm about wanting only an agreement, now found himself wanting more. He didn't want to scare her, didn't want her to think he was changing the rules of the game. But within himself, Albert struggled with the idea that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, he wanted more than just a legacy. He wanted a family. He wanted her by his side, not just as the mother of his children, but as a partner. On the other hand, Cindy also felt the changes. Albert's constant attention, his care, the tenderness disguised in his gestures, began to affect her in ways she hadn't expected. In the beginning, she had accepted the arrangement practically, thinking it would just be a pregnancy and then she would move on with her life. But now, seeing Albert so present, so dedicated, she couldn't help but feel something growing inside her. It was more than gratitude for his care. It was something deeper, something she tried not to admit to herself. She was becoming attached to him. Cindy found herself smiling when she thought of Albert. She felt warmth in her chest every time he held her hand or looked at her in a way that seemed to pierce through any cold barriers he had erected around himself. He had always been a distant boss, but now he was different, more human, closer. And she felt that this wasn't just because of the babies. It was something between them, something growing every day. They were both connected by the children to come, but at the same time, a new bond was forming, one that transcended the lines of the contract that had once defined their relationship. With each passing day, Albert and Cindy grew closer, although neither of them had the courage to speak about it. The exchanged glances, the subtle touches, the conversations that stretched late into the night, all indicated that there was something more between them. Albert, despite becoming more and more involved, still didn't know how to express what he felt. He, who had always been practical, who had always avoided any emotional complications, was now diving into uncharted territory. On the other hand, Cindy, who had always been reserved, now found herself yearning for his presence, hoping he would say something that would confirm what she already suspected, that what was happening between them was more than just an arrangement. And so they both moved in a delicate balance, each with their hidden feelings, yet both knowing deep down that something was changing. The pregnancy continued, the babies grew, but something greater was being created between them, something that no contract could have predicted. When the triplets were born, Albert was by Cindy's side in the delivery room. He held her hand as she struggled to give birth, and when the first cry echoed through the room, Albert felt something break inside him. He had spent his whole life believing that love wasn't real, that it was just a social contract that ultimately failed, but there, in front of his children, he realized that something much greater was happening. The babies had been born a few weeks ago, and Albert's mansion, which used to be cold and silent, now vibrated with the gentle sounds of the triplets. Cindy, after giving birth, was recovering well, and the nannies were always around, helping to take care of the little ones. It was an almost surreal scene for her. From a discreet employee at the office, she now found herself the mother of 3 children, living in a luxurious house, surrounded by all the comfort that Albert could provide. But something in her mind wouldn't let her completely relax. The contract. The agreement that had once been made between them still loomed over her head. There was a deadline, a moment when she would have to leave it all behind. The babies, Albert, the life that, little by little, was becoming part of who she was. One night, after the babies had been put to sleep under the care of the nannies, Cindy found herself alone in one of the mansion's lounges, resting in a soft armchair. At that hour, the mansion was enveloped in a comforting silence, the kind of tranquility that would normally make her feel at peace. But that night, her heart was restless. It was then that Albert entered. He watched her for a moment from the entrance of the lounge, his gaze gentle and full of thoughts. There was something he needed to say for weeks, but until then, he hadn't found the right moment. Now, with the babies well taken care of and the future hanging over their heads, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Cindy," he called, his voice low but firm. She looked up at him and smiled, a tired smile but full of tenderness. "Albert, would you like to sit?" she asked, gesturing to the chair beside her. He nodded and sat down near her, his gaze fixed on hers, as if he were searching for the right words. For a moment, there was only silence between them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was filled with unspoken emotions. "I've been thinking," Albert began, breaking the silence. "About us, about all of this. The babies, the life we've been living these past few weeks." Cindy felt a pang of anxiety in her chest. She knew that, sooner or later, this conversation would come, and for a second, she feared what he was about to say. "About the contract?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm, but with her heart racing. Albert took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, about the contract. Cindy, I I've decided that it's time to put an end to it." His words felt like a shock. What did he mean by put an end to it? Her heart skipped a beat, and she felt panic start to set in. "Put an end, how?" she asked with a touch of fear in her voice. "Are you asking me to leave?" She couldn't hide the nervousness, the fear of being discarded. Over the past months, she had grown attached not just to the babies, but also to Albert. He had become more than just the father of her children. He had become someone for whom she felt something deep, though she never had the courage to admit it. Albert immediately shook his head, realizing the misunderstanding. "No, Cindy, that's not it." He leaned closer, taking her hand gently, as if his words were as important as they were fragile. "What I mean is that this contract no longer means anything. That's not what ended up happening between us." Cindy looked at him, surprised but still cautious. "So what are you saying, Albert?" He let out a sigh, as if relieved to finally be able to say what he had been holding back for so long. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Cindy. I know this wasn't the plan, that the agreement was clear from the beginning. But the truth is that over these months, as you carried our children, I began to see you in a way I never had before. I've fallen in love. I can't pretend anymore that this," he said, pointing to the space between them, "is just a contract." Cindy felt tears forming in her eyes. It was everything she had been afraid to wish for, and at the same time, what her heart longed for the most. You're in love with me?" she asked, her voice breaking, incredulous. Albert nodded, squeezing her hand. "Yes. I love you. I don't want you to leave. I don't want this contract to decide our future. What I want is for you to stay here with me, not as part of an agreement, but as my woman. I want us to raise our children together, as a family." Cindy was silent for a moment, feeling the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She had always known that something was growing between them, but she had never dared to think that Albert, so steadfast in his decisions, could feel the same. Tears rolled silently down her face, but they were tears of relief and happiness. "Albert," she began, her voice soft, "I've fallen in love with you too." The words came out easily, finally freed from all the fear that had held her back. "I didn't want to admit it because I thought it was just me. But the truth is that you've made me feel loved, cared for, and I want to be with you. Not just for our children, but for us." Albert smiled, a genuine smile, full of emotion. He leaned in and wrapped her in a tight embrace, the first that carried no weight of contracts, no agreements, but only the love that had grown between them. "Now we're a family," he whispered softly in her ear. "You, me, and our 3 children. Forever." And in that moment, in the comfort of the mansion that was now full of life and love, Albert and Cindy left behind a past marked by contracts and cold agreements. They chose to move forward as a family, united not just by their children, but by the love they had found in each other. Did you enjoy this touching story between Albert, Cindy, and their 3 little miracles? We'd love to hear what you think. Leave us a comment and tell us how this journey of love and transformation touched you. We're curious to know what your favorite moment was and if your heart also beat faster along with theirs. Don't forget to share your emotions with us in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.